At 4:47 in the morning on May 11th, 1945, the jungle near Dingalan Bay on the eastern coast of Luzon was quiet in the way only a jungle can be before dawn. Not peaceful, just still. The Philippine campaign had been grinding on for months, and by that point in the war, the United States Army had already suffered more than 60,000 casualties across the islands. Luzon was supposed to be nearly secured, but the men fighting there knew better. Japanese units scattered across the interior had not surrendered. They waited, they watched, and they struck when men were tired enough to believe the danger had passed. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, part of the 33rd Infantry Division, had established a small perimeter near the bay to protect a critical supply route. It wasn't a large position, no concrete bunkers, no heavy fortifications, just foxholes, sandbags, tents, and a single light machine gun covering the main approach. The men had been on edge for weeks, living on broken sleep and constant alerts. By early May, exhaustion had settled in deeper than fear. Private John McKinney had just finished a long shift manning that machine gun. He was 24 years old. He had been in the Army for 2.5 years. He had crossed the Pacific with the division in 1943, fought through New Guinea, endured malaria, dysentery, and the slow, grinding pressure of jungle warfare. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't decorated. He wasn't someone people talked about. He did his job, kept to himself, and went where he was told. McKinney came from Screven County, Georgia. His father was a sharecropper. The family had very little. John left school after the 3rd grade because working the land mattered more than reading books. What he did learn, he learned outside. He learned how to hunt before he learned how to write his own name. As a boy, he fed his family with a .22 rifle, tracking squirrels and rabbits through the woods, learning patience, learning silence, learning how small mistakes could cost you everything. When he enlisted in November 1942 at Fort McPherson, the Army quickly realized he could barely read. They also realized something else. He could shoot better than almost anyone they had ever tested. His qualification scores were exceptional. Drill instructors noticed how he moved in the field, how he watched tree lines instead of roads, how he seemed more comfortable in the dark than in daylight. That morning, none of that mattered. McKinney walked a few steps from the machine gun position to his tent. He laid down with his M1 Garand beside him. Around him, the camp settled into a fragile quiet. The jungle hummed with insects. Leaves shifted in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, unseen and unheard, more than 100 Japanese soldiers were already moving through the trees. No alarms were raised. No shots were fired. No one knew that the perimeter had been studied for days, that guard rotations had been counted, that swords and bayonets had been drawn for a silent approach. Inside his tent, John McKinney closed his eyes, believing, for just a few hours, that the worst of the night was over. While the American camp near Dingalan Bay drifted into uneasy rest, the jungle beyond the perimeter was already awake. For several days, Japanese forces operating in eastern Luzon had been watching this position from the cover of the trees. These were not fresh units. They were remnants of formations that had been shattered earlier in the Philippine campaign, soldiers who knew the war was nearly lost but continued to fight anyway. Surrender was not an option they considered. Survival, honor, and momentum mattered more than numbers. The outpost of Company A, 123rd Infantry Regiment, had been carefully studied. Japanese scouts observed the Americans at a distance, memorizing routines, counting tents, tracking guard changes, and identifying the most important weapon in the perimeter, a single light machine gun positioned to cover the main approach. They learned how many men were usually on watch. They learned when fatigue slowed reactions. They learned where darkness created blind spots. By the early hours of May 11, 1945, more than 100 Japanese soldiers had gathered in the jungle east of the American lines. Many carried Arisaka rifles. Others carried grenades, knee mortars, and swords. Their orders were direct and brutally simple. Overrun the position. Kill everyone. Capture the supplies. There would be no warning shots, no probing attacks. Speed and silence would decide everything. At approximately 4:45 a.m., the force began to move. The men advanced in small groups, barefoot or moving carefully to avoid snapping branches or disturbing leaves. The jungle swallowed sound. The outer American guard post was bypassed without detection. The attackers moved exactly where they had planned to move, stepping through gaps in the perimeter that had been identified days earlier. Leading the advance element was Sergeant Fukutaro Mori. His assignment was critical. He was to eliminate the first Americans silently, using swords and bayonets only. Gunfire would alert the rest of the camp. Silence would give the main force time to flood through the perimeter before the defenders understood what was happening. The success of the entire operation depended on those first few seconds. Inside the American camp, no one sensed the shift. No flares lit the sky, no dogs barked. The men of Company A had endured countless false alarms over the previous weeks. Most believed this night would pass like the others. Exhaustion dulls instincts. Routine creates dangerous confidence. Sergeant Mori reached the edge of the tent line. He moved past sleeping soldiers without disturbing them, his outline blending with the darkness. One tent lay slightly apart from the others. Inside, he could hear slow, steady breathing. He paused long enough to confirm the sound, then raised his sword. The American inside the tent was Private John McKinney, 24 years old, asleep on the ground. His M1 Garand lay beside him, exactly where it always did. He had no idea that a blade was already in motion above him, or that nearly 100 enemy soldiers were closing in on the men he had fought beside for months. At that same moment, Japanese assault elements were spreading out along the perimeter. Some prepared to rush the machine gun position, others waited for the signal to advance once the silent kills were complete. The plan was unfolding exactly as intended. The Americans were still asleep. The jungle was still quiet. From the attacker's perspective, the outcome was already decided. The perimeter would collapse in minutes, the machine gun would be turned inward, the camp would be destroyed before dawn fully broke over Luzon. No one inside the tents knew that the first strike was already falling, or that the distance between sleep and death had narrowed to less than a second. At 4:51 a.m., Sergeant Fukutaro Mori pulled open the flap of the tent. The movement was fast, practiced, silent. The sword was already in motion before the American inside could fully wake. Mori aimed for the neck. One clean, diagonal strike. No noise, no resistance. He misjudged the distance. The blade struck the side of Private John McKinney's head instead. Steel cut through flesh and cartilage. Part of McKinney's right ear was severed instantly. Blood sprayed across the inside of the canvas. Pain exploded through his skull before his eyes even opened. McKinney woke to fire in his head and the dark outline of a man standing over him with a raised sword. There was no time to think, no time to ask questions. Mori was already lifting the blade again for a second strike. This one would finish it. McKinney's hand moved on instinct alone. He did not aim. He did not shout. He reached for the M1 Garand lying beside him and swung it with everything he had. The wooden rifle butt caught Mori under the chin with enough force to shatter bone. The Japanese sergeant staggered backward. McKinney swung again. The second blow crushed Mori's skull. The man collapsed without a sound. Outside the tent, footsteps were already moving fast, dozens of them. McKinney pushed himself upright. His head rang. Warm blood ran down his neck and soaked his collar. His right ear was gone. He could hear shouting now. Muzzle flashes flickered in the darkness beyond the tent line. The main assault had begun. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. What he saw stopped him cold. 30 yards away, the machine gun position was erupting in chaos. 3 Americans had been there minutes earlier. Now there were screams, shadows struggling around the sandbags, and the sharp crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the heavier report of American M1s. Japanese soldiers were pouring through the northeastern side of the perimeter in waves. McKinney's mind snapped into focus. That machine gun was everything. It covered the main approach to the camp. If the Japanese captured it and turned it inward, the entire perimeter would be raked with fire. Every man in Company A would die in their tents. There was no order, no signal, no one telling him what to do. McKinney ran. 2 American soldiers had been replacing him at the gun. Private James Hendricks had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the opening seconds. The third man made a decision that saved a life and doomed a position. He grabbed Hendricks and dragged him toward the rear of the camp. The machine gun was left undefended. 10 Japanese soldiers reached the gun pit first. They vaulted the sandbags, rifles raised, one already trying to rotate the weapon. The others formed a rough security ring, watching for an American counterattack. McKinney did not slow down. He did not take cover. He charged straight at them. The Japanese saw him coming. One bleeding American alone, sprinting across open ground in the half-light before dawn. 2 soldiers raised their rifles. McKinney fired first. One man dropped at 15 yards. Another fell at 10. He kept firing as he ran. 4 shots, 4 bodies. McKinney leapt into the gun pit. The space was barely 8 feet by 6 feet. 6 enemy soldiers were still alive inside it. Some were trying to bring rifles around. Others reached for bayonets. One was still fumbling with the machine gun's mechanism. McKinney fired at point-blank range. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds. He had already fired 4. He put the next 3 into 3 men at distances measured in inches. 1 round left. The 8th soldier lunged at him with a bayonet raised. McKinney fired. The bolt locked back with a metallic ping. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive. They knew what that sound meant. McKinney reversed his grip on the rifle and swung it like an axe. The first man collapsed. The second tried to block with his forearm. The rifle shattered bone and continued into his skull. The third lunged. McKinney sidestepped and brought the butt down on the back of the man's neck. The vertebrae cracked. 10 Japanese soldiers had taken the machine gun. Less than 30 seconds later, all 10 were dead. McKinney stood in the pit, blood running down his face, surrounded by bodies. The most important weapon in the perimeter was still in American hands, but it was broken, and the attack was far from over. McKinney reached for the machine gun the moment the last body dropped inside the pit. His hands found the receiver by instinct. This was the weapon that held the perimeter together. It dominated the main approach. It was the reason Company A had been able to sleep at all. If it worked, the camp might survive. If it didn't, everyone would die. Something was wrong. The charging handle would not move. The feed tray was bent. The bolt was jammed solid. During the struggle, the gun had been damaged beyond immediate repair. McKinney cycled it again, harder this time. Nothing. The light machine gun was dead. He lifted his head just as the eastern horizon began to lighten. In the gray half-light before sunrise, he could see movement at the edge of the jungle. Japanese soldiers were regrouping. Not running now. Watching. Counting. Adjusting. The first wave had failed, but it had not broken them. McKinney checked his rifle. The M1 Garand was empty, 8 rounds gone. He was bleeding heavily from the side of his head. His ear was a torn mass of flesh and blood. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the sudden drop in adrenaline after the violence inside the pit. He bent down and pulled a bandolier from one of the dead Japanese soldiers. American .30-06 ammunition, taken from previous fighting, carried forward for exactly this moment. McKinney slammed a fresh clip into his rifle. The bolt snapped forward. He was back in the fight. A voice rose from the jungle, an officer shouting orders in Japanese. McKinney could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. The attack was coming again. The second wave emerged from the trees at roughly 60 yards. At least 20 soldiers in the first line, more behind them. Rifles with fixed bayonets. They advanced at a run, screaming as they closed the distance, expecting to find a captured machine gun position firing back into the American camp. Instead, they found one man standing in the gun pit with a rifle. McKinney rested the front sight on the lead soldier and squeezed the trigger. The man fell. He shifted left. Another fell. Then another. The M1 kicked against his shoulder as brass casings ejected to his right. He did not think about the shots. He did not count. His body remembered what his mind did not need to process. 8 rounds. The clip ejected with a metallic ping. The charging Japanese had covered 20 yards during the reload, 40 yards now. McKinney slammed in another clip and fired again. Some of the attackers reached 15 yards before they fell. Others tried to veer off, looking for cover that did not exist. He tracked them and fired. A moving target was easier than a stationary one. He had learned that hunting deer as a boy in Georgia. The second wave broke. The survivors scattered back toward the jungle, leaving bodies strewn across the open ground in front of the pit. McKinney counted quickly. 11 more down. 21 total since the attack began. There was no time to rest. A hollow thump sounded from the trees, then another. Knee mortars. The first round exploded 10 yards to his left. Dirt and shrapnel slammed into the sandbags. McKinney flattened himself against the wall as another round landed closer. The Japanese had learned. They were not going to charge blindly again. The third round struck the parapet directly. The sandbags collapsed inward. McKinney was half exposed now, crouched in a pit that had become a death trap. Mortar fire adjusted with every shot. Staying meant being buried alive or torn apart. A grenade landed inside the pit less than 3 feet away. McKinney grabbed it and threw it back over the sandbags. It exploded in midair. The blast knocked him sideways. His ears rang, blood soaked through the rag he had pressed against his head. He understood the tactical problem immediately. The machine gun was useless. The pit drew mortar fire. Holding position no longer protected the camp. It only marked him as a target. Staying meant death. McKinney grabbed 2 more bandoliers from the bodies around him and slung them over his shoulder. He waited for a pause in the explosions, counted to 3, and ran. Rifle fire snapped from the jungle. Bullets cut through the air around him. He sprinted 15 yards to a shallow depression in the ground, barely more than a dip in the terrain, and threw himself into it as rounds kicked up dirt inches from his face. From there, he looked back at the gun pit. It was full of bodies. The weapon that had anchored the entire perimeter lay broken among them. The Japanese believed they had finally driven him off. They were wrong. McKinney crawled to the edge of the depression, found a firing angle, and waited. From the shallow depression, McKinney watched the edge of the jungle instead of the bodies behind him. He understood something had changed. The Japanese were no longer charging blindly. The screaming waves were gone. The rifle fire faded into something more deliberate, quieter, smarter. They had learned. From their perspective, the battlefield no longer made sense. The machine gun position had fired, then gone silent. Rifle fire had come from the pit, then from somewhere else. Mortar fire had driven the defender away, yet the killing had continued from a new angle. Reports moved up the line in short, urgent bursts. Muzzle flashes from multiple positions. Heavy casualties. No clear target. It looked like several Americans working together, but it wasn't. As dawn spread across the clearing, Japanese officers began to understand the truth. There was only one rifle, one man, and that knowledge changed everything. The knee mortars resumed, but now the rounds were spaced wider, searching instead of saturating. Grenades followed, tossed toward likely firing positions rather than directly into the pit. The Japanese infantry stopped moving in groups. Instead, individual soldiers advanced while others covered them, creeping forward yard by yard. McKinney felt the pressure immediately. His head pounded. Blood still ran down his neck from the ruined ear. His legs burned from sprinting, crouching, sprinting again. He had been fighting for nearly 20 minutes already, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the first assaults was draining fast. He checked his ammunition. Less than he wanted. Not enough for another prolonged stand. A movement at the tree line caught his eye. 2 squads emerged at a fast walk, rifles up, spreading out instead of bunching together. They were heading toward the abandoned machine gun pit, confident that the American had been driven off. McKinney waited. He let them reach 30 yards, then he opened fire. The first man dropped instantly, the second fell before he understood where the shots were coming from. The rest scattered, but there was no cover between the trees and the pit. McKinney fired, reloaded, fired again. Bodies fell across the open ground. The survivors dove into shallow depressions or pressed themselves flat against the earth. They had expected a retreat. Instead, they had walked into a new killing zone. McKinney did not stay there. He never fired more than a few seconds from the same spot. As the Japanese tried to locate his muzzle flash, he shifted 10 yards to his right, found another low dip in the terrain, and fired again. The shots came from different angles, different distances. To the men under fire, it felt like being hunted by a team. In reality, it was one exhausted private moving as fast as his body allowed. He was doing what he had done his entire childhood in the Georgia woods. Never stay where the animal expects you to be. Never fire twice from the same place. Confuse. Disorient. Control the movement. The Japanese were disoriented now. They pulled back again, leaving more dead behind. McKinney counted quickly. The number was climbing. Too fast. Too many. He did not dwell on it. Numbers did not matter yet. Survival did. Then the mortars shifted. Rounds began falling closer to his new positions, walking in with each explosion. The Japanese were adjusting again. Observers were watching for movement, tracking where the shots originated. McKinney understood the danger immediately. If he stayed still, the next round would land on him. He waited for a break, then ran. Bullets cracked through the air as he sprinted toward the machine gun pit, zigzagging instinctively. He dove the last few feet and landed among the bodies he had created earlier. The smell hit him hard. Blood, cordite, death. He ignored it. He needed ammunition. He moved fast, pulling bandoliers and clips from the dead. American ammunition pouches taken as trophies, loose rounds stuffed into pockets. He gathered everything he could carry, 64 more rounds, enough to keep fighting. Barely. A Japanese soldier appeared suddenly over the sandbags. The man had crawled forward while McKinney scavenged. His rifle was already coming up. McKinney shot him at 2 feet. No hesitation, no pause. He grabbed the grenades from the dead man's belt, Japanese Type 97s. He had never used them before, but he had seen them used. He pulled the pin, struck the cap, counted, and threw. The explosion was followed by screaming. He threw another toward the tree line where muzzle flashes clustered, more screaming. Then he ran again. McKinney dropped into a shell crater 15 yards away, deeper than his previous positions, just enough cover to protect him from direct fire. From there he could see the entire approach. Bodies littered the ground. Some moved weakly, wounded men trying to crawl back toward the jungle. He let them go. A wounded man tied up 2 others. Every casualty multiplied the enemy's problems. The mortar fire stopped, not because they had run out of rounds, but because they had lost sight of him. McKinney reloaded his clips calmly, hands working on habit alone. 8 rounds per clip, 10 reloads, 80 rounds left. 80 rounds, 1 man, and somewhere in the jungle, officers were realizing that they were no longer hunting an outpost. They were hunting him. McKinney did not think in terms of fronts or flanks. He thought the way a hunter thinks, not the way an infantry manual teaches. The jungle was not a battlefield to him. It was terrain. Movement mattered more than position. Surprise mattered more than volume of fire. From the shell crater, he fired only long enough to force a reaction. Then he moved. 10 yards, sometimes 15, never in a straight line. When the Japanese answered with rifle fire, they were always shooting at where he had been, not where he was. To the officers watching from the tree line, the situation became increasingly confusing. Shots were coming from the abandoned machine gun pit, then from a depression to the east, then from behind the supply area. Muzzle flashes appeared, vanished, and reappeared somewhere else seconds later. Casualties continued to mount, but there was no single point to fix, no obvious position to overrun. Reports filtered back through the ranks. Heavy rifle fire from multiple positions, interlocking fields of fire, an American defense that was far stronger than expected. It was all wrong. There was still only 1 man. McKinney let a flanking attempt develop before he acted. 2 Japanese squads moved wide, trying to bypass the killing ground he had created. They advanced cautiously, using falling logs and shallow dips for cover, believing they were slipping past one defender into another's field of fire. McKinney watched them go. When the lead elements reached the open ground near the supply tents, he shifted again. He ran low, cutting across the inside of the perimeter, and dropped behind a stack of ammunition crates. From there, he waited until the first soldiers appeared between the tents. They never saw him. The first 3 men fell before the others understood they were under fire. The 4th tried to turn, rifle halfway up. He dropped 2. The remaining soldiers scattered, diving for cover that did not protect them from where McKinney now fired. He pinned them in place, cutting off their retreat and their advance. More Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle, drawn toward the sound of firing. To them, it looked like an American counterattack. A coordinated defense responding exactly where it was needed. McKinney changed position again. He fired a few rounds from behind the crates, then moved to the shadow of another tent, then to a shallow foxhole that had been abandoned earlier when its occupant reinforced a different section of the perimeter. Each burst of fire came from a new direction. Each movement reinforced the same illusion. The Japanese commander committed more men. They advanced from 2 directions now, one from the original northeastern approach, another from the south. It was meant to split the American fire, force defenders to choose which attack to engage. McKinney engaged both. 4 rounds to the south. 2 men fell. He pivoted northeast and fired again. 2 more dropped. The M1 locked open. He reloaded in seconds and fired back south. The attacks stalled. The soldiers went to ground, returning fire blindly into shadows they could not penetrate. By now, McKinney had been fighting for over 25 minutes. His arms felt heavy. His breathing came hard. Blood loss dulled the edges of his vision, but his movements remained precise. He never stayed long enough for the Japanese to adjust. They began to change tactics again. The attack slowed. Individual soldiers advanced while others covered them. One moved, another followed, leapfrogging closer, shrinking the distance yard by yard. It was a method designed to overwhelm a single defender. Even the best shot could not track multiple threats approaching from different angles. McKinney recognized it immediately. He had seen it in the woods. Coyotes hunting deer. One distracts, another circles. The prey watches one threat while the others close in. For the first time, he understood that he was no longer shaping the fight. He was being hunted. The Japanese closed to within 20 yards on one side, 15 on the other. McKinney checked his ammunition again, less than 30 rounds. Not enough to hold, not enough to retreat slowly. So he did the one thing they did not expect. He attacked. McKinney burst from cover and charged directly at the nearest group. The sudden movement shattered their timing. He fired while running, dropping one man, then another. At the fallen palm tree they had been using for cover, he met them at close range. One went down to rifle fire. Another fell to the rifle butt. A third tried to flee. McKinney shot him in the back at 3 yards. He did not stop. Stopping meant being surrounded. He turned, fired again at the second group closing in, and now, with dawn fully breaking over Luzon, McKinney stood alone in the open, knowing the next phase would be the... They advanced one at a time, low and careful, covering each other, closing the distance with patience. It was methodical, relentless, designed to exhaust. McKinney kept moving. Another group rushed in from his right. He turned and fired again. 2 men dropped. The M1 Garand locked open with its metallic ping. Empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. One tackled him around the waist. They hit the ground hard. Another stomped on his wounded ear. White-hot pain exploded through his head. The third raised his bayonet for a killing thrust. McKinney grabbed the ankle of the man standing over him and twisted. The soldier lost his balance and fell. McKinney rolled, throwing off the man who had tackled him, and scrambled to his knees. His rifle lay just out of reach. He lunged for it, swung blindly, and felt the impact connect with a skull. He swung again, and again. The last man fell. McKinney stood there, gasping, barely upright, vision tunneling. His hands shook violently now. He looked around and saw movement at the edge of the jungle. 2 more Japanese soldiers stepped out cautiously, rifles raised, scanning for the American who had destroyed their attack. McKinney raised his rifle. Click. Empty. For a fraction of a second, everything stopped. The 2 soldiers saw him standing there, alone, covered in blood, surrounded by bodies. They hesitated. McKinney charged. He crossed the distance before they could react. The first soldier tried to bring his rifle up. Too slow. McKinney drove the rifle butt under the man's chin and dropped him where he stood. The second turned to run. McKinney chased him down in 3 strides and clubbed him from behind. Silence followed. The jungle went still. McKinney stood there breathing hard, chest heaving, muscles trembling from exhaustion. The attack had begun at approximately 4:47 a.m. It was now a little after 5:20. 36 minutes had passed since the sword had cut into his tent. He looked around the perimeter. Bodies lay everywhere. Near the broken machine gun, in shell craters, between supply tents, along the tree line. Men who had come expecting an easy victory and had found something else entirely. McKinney found another rifle among the dead, an M1 with a full clip. He picked it up, letting his damaged weapon fall. He moved toward the southwest, where he remembered seeing the muzzle flashes of the knee mortars earlier in the fight. 2 Japanese soldiers were there, scrambling to reposition their weapon. McKinney shot them both from 45 yards. They fell without a sound. After that, there was nothing. No more rifle fire, no more mortars, no more movement in the jungle. Just the low moans of wounded men and the buzzing of insects returning to the clearing. McKinney stood alone in the gray morning light of Luzon, bloodied, exhausted, barely holding himself upright. The battle was over, and somehow he was still alive. The first American soldiers reached the northeast perimeter cautiously, rifles raised, expecting resistance that never came. They had been fighting their own battles on the western edge of the camp, pushing back Japanese attackers in the darkness. It took them 36 minutes to reach the section where the machine gun had been. What they found there stopped them in their tracks. Private John McKinney was standing among the bodies, barely upright, holding a rifle that was not his own. His uniform was torn and soaked through with blood. His right ear was shredded, wrapped in a dark, makeshift bandage. Around him, Japanese soldiers lay where they had fallen, slumped over sandbags, sprawled in shell craters, piled near the broken machine gun. The air smelled of cordite, blood, and damp earth. The platoon sergeant ordered his men to secure the area, then to count the dead. They counted once and did not believe the number. They counted again. 38 Japanese soldiers lay dead within the immediate perimeter near the machine gun position. 2 more were found near the knee mortar emplacement, roughly 45 yards away. 40 confirmed enemy dead in an area 1 man had defended alone. When the sergeant asked McKinney what had happened, the private gave a short account. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. He spoke without drama, without embellishment, as if describing farm work back in Georgia. The officers listening assumed there had to be more defenders. There always were in stories like this. There were not. An investigation followed. Battalion headquarters reviewed the reports. Division intelligence officers examined the battlefield, the spent M1 casings, the angles of fire, the placement of bodies. Witnesses were interviewed. The conclusion was unavoidable. The report was accurate. Private John McKinney had single-handedly repelled an attack by approximately 100 Japanese soldiers near Dingalan Bay on May 11, 1945. He had killed 40 of them in 36 minutes. His actions had prevented the collapse of Company A's perimeter and likely saved dozens of American lives. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved through channels. It was approved. On January 23, 1946, McKinney stood in the White House as President Harry S. Truman placed the nation's highest military decoration around his neck. The citation spoke of extraordinary gallantry and intrepidity, of action above and beyond the call of duty. McKinney did not give speeches. He did not seek attention. When reporters asked about the battle, he gave the same brief answers he had given his sergeant. The tent, the sword, the machine gun. Then he went home. He returned to Screven County, Georgia, to the same land he had left behind. He farmed, he hunted, he raised a family. He rarely spoke about Luzon. The Medal of Honor sat out of sight. The war followed him anyway, in his sleep, in sudden movements, in the way he woke reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. There was no name for what he carried then, no diagnosis. Veterans were told to move on, to be grateful, to stay quiet. McKinney stayed quiet. He lived most of his life as he had before the war, known more for his work than his past. He died in 1997, far from any battlefield, long after the jungle of Luzon had reclaimed the ground where he stood alone that morning. The sign bearing his name now stands beside a highway in Georgia. Most people pass it without a second glance. They do not know about the tent before dawn. They do not know about the machine gun or the 36 minutes or the silence that followed. That silence is part of the story too, because after the heroism, after the medals, after the numbers are counted, what remains is a man who did what he had to do, survived what he should not have survived, and then spent the rest of his life trying to be ordinary again.